Hello everyone, welcome to the Oxford Policy Podcast. This is Marc and Eleanor, MPP student here at the Blavatnik School of Government. Eleanor is also co-chair of the Geoeconomic Cluster. And today we are pleased to be joined by Jenny Bates. Jenny Bates is former Director General for the Indo-Pacific at the FCDO, and she is now the Heywood Fellow at the Blavatnik School of Government, working on the UK strategy for the changing global economic order. Thank you very much, Jenny, for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here.
So you spent your 2 decades shaping UK economic policy, working for different departments across trade, industry, diplomacy. What's one thing you believed when you joined the UK government that you no longer believe?
That's a great question. I think probably it's I'm a product of my era. So I came into the workforce in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And at that time, there was a very strong sense that globalization was emerging and moving in one direction and that countries were becoming more like each other. I think if you're European, you saw the movement of the Eastern European nations to joining the European Union and becoming more Western and more capitalist model. You also saw the rise of many more African nations joining the trading system. So there was understandably this sense that we were moving in a kind of single direction under the security umbrella, particularly provided by the United States. And that was the era of the end of history and the world is flat. And looking back now, I realised that was an era in history and not a destiny. And I realised that actually we're becoming more different now. And really the challenge is partly about managing that difference.
So that takes us really nicely to the core topic of this podcast, which is about geoeconomics. And obviously geoeconomics means different things to different people. Some see it as economics weaponized for geopolitical ends. Others see it as something a bit broader than that. How do you define it? And does the definition even matter for governments?
It's certainly a word that's being used a lot more, and there are whole teams and consultancies being built around geoeconomics. I don't have a sort of specific definition of it. I do think it's about the return of power and power relations into economic questions. And I'm somebody that's got a degree in economics and a degree in international relations. And I feel like it's the bringing together of those two worlds a bit. The way we've talked about it in the work I've been doing is that you've had a sort of model of globalization, the thing we called the global economic order, this kind of system of globalization. And there are now more forces really pushing onto that system, one of which is competition, geostrategic competition, contestation, and that is shaping the way in which the global economic system works. I think the bit that's sometimes underestimated in geoeconomics is the domestic politics. So we talk about this a lot in the work as well, the pressure coming onto globalization from domestic content, the political context, the fracturing of societies a bit domestically. So I think it's both. I think and they're linked, but it's that broader sense that the kind of economic system is being pressured by forces of power, and we have to find ways to manage that.
I think post-Brexit, obviously the UK rebuilt its economic foreign policy toolkit. In your experience, recognising, as Marc introduced, multiple departments there, in your experience, how well has Whitehall actually understood the way that you've framed geoeconomics there as a discipline? And where are some of the blind spots, perhaps?
Yeah. So again, I think historians are going to look back and think it was very interesting that the UK left the EU as we were entering this era. And I think for a while we were very focused on, it took us to a place where we were more focused on our bilateral relationship with Europe. And it maybe meant we were spending less time as a system thinking about the wider world. I think the security part of Whitehall was doing great work in thinking about that. We published an integrated review and national security reviews. But I do think the economic part of the system was spending a lot of time managing Brexit and was doing less of that sort of deep thinking. So I think that's one of the bits we haven't done as much on. I think we've been fairly good at understanding the more diverse system. So the idea that you've got a rising number of powers, that you're not operating in this unipolar world anymore. You've got middle income countries. There was a lot of work done in the early days post-Brexit to think about things like joining CPTPP and building partnerships beyond the obvious ones. But I think the bit we really haven't spent enough time on is the power and contestation piece. And I think that's the part that we're now really having to grapple with.
And now you're reflecting on these questions as a Heywood Fellow here at the Blavatnik School of Government. For those who don't know what's the Heywood Fellowship, can you explain it quickly and what motivated you to do this fellowship?
Yeah, so it's a really unique and rather special opportunity. It's a fellowship for a senior civil servant to step outside of being in a government role for a year and to spend time thinking here at the Blavatnik School. It's sponsored by the British government and the Heywood Foundation, which is a charity that was set up in the name of a former Cabinet Secretary, Jeremy Heywood, who I had the opportunity of working with in my career. And he sadly passed away quite young, and the charity was set up in his name. And the idea is to have a period of time to sort of step out of government and think about a particular question, and to have the space to do that in thinking and writing in your own name. So I'm not representing the British government in this work, it's my work. And also to have a longer term time horizon. So I'm thinking over 15 years, sort of multiple parliaments in the British government sort of framing. So that's the fellowship. And then you, as the fellow, you choose the topic. So I've chosen this question of the global economic order, mostly because it's a question I was really starting to think about inside government. I felt that we were not grappling with it enough, and I didn't have enough time in a busy day job to really think about it.
And so can you talk us a bit about your work? We had the chance at the Blavatnik School to have a glimpse of the work you're doing. You identified 4 scenarios. Can you tell us about these 4 scenarios?
Yeah. So I am relentlessly focused on what the UK should do and to manage and navigate these changes. And I am a little sad, but perhaps not surprised, that as I've spent some time looking at the academic literature, that not much is written about the UK. Much is written about the US and China and Europe. And so I'm a big believer we have to ground our strategy in what matters to the UK. The reason I've done some scenarios is that I have read some great work on this, and I'm a trained economist, and my natural instinct would be to do modelling. But I think that we're in a world of significant uncertainty, radical uncertainty. And if you're in that kind of world, a better technique is to think about scenarios, because we don't actually know where we're going. So I created these 4 scenarios. We did some really interesting discussion, including with colleagues here. And essentially, they all challenge the UK. So I won't go into great length on them, but there are 4. One looks at a world where the US really steps away from its leadership role of the global economic system and stays further removed from that. Call that G0. One where there's much more contestation and much more weaponization of economic levers. And in that scenario, we also have many countries doing more what I describe as strategic national capitalism, so much more state intervention in the economy. That's a G versus G. We have one where the US and China find a way to accommodate each other a bit more, perhaps in the more kind of détente kind of framing. We call that a G2. And then the last one is driven much more by technology and the concentration of economic power in large technology companies who are in this scenario not British. The challenge with these scenarios is that they all pose challenges for the UK and none of them involve going back to where we've been. And as many people have said to me, you might actually go through various of these scenarios as we go through the future. So none of them are forecasts, and I think that's probably right. We might be in many of them. What I'm trying to work out is what is a sensible strategy under many or most of those scenarios. So what are sensible things to be doing if you're in one or more of these scenarios at some point. And that's how they're helpful, I think.
And so as a follow-up, how the UK government can prepare to each of these scenarios? What recommendation would you propose for the UK to thrive in all of these scenarios?
Yeah. So we, I think, need to move away from the framing that we've had. And I said this in the paper that I published in January. I tried to describe the current or inherited UK policy, and I described us as an activist globalizer. And I think that is a good description of where we've been. And I think when you look at these scenarios, we need to move to a different framing, which I think is more about building secure openness. I think that means we need to put much more focus on resilience and how we build that into our economic policy. And we need to put much more focus on agency, how we go about having influence and impact, but also in agency, how we give ourselves enough space to experiment and test and try as we're going through a very uncertain period. So those are some of the things that feel like it's worth putting an investment into under most of these scenarios, in addition to continuing to make sure we build competitiveness and sort of strength at home.
So agency, resilience, competitiveness, what do you think is going to be the hardest, for instance? What requires the most reform?
Yeah, this is an excellent question. We think about this a lot in the team. I think the competitiveness bit is the easier part for the UK because it's about reframing what we've already been doing, but for a new era. I think the resilience bit is going to be challenging. And what I'm talking about in my work is resilience, not just to external shocks like pandemics and financial crises. It's resilience to power and coercion. And this is something that we have not thought enough about in the economic system. And it's very uncomfortable. Back to my 2 degrees, the economic community find that harder because it's a very different frame from the win-win cooperation that much of economics is based around. So I think how we think about the careful management of dealing with power and coercion and what the right strategy for the UK is, I think that's going to be hard. I would also say, I'm probably not allowed 2 things, but on agency, we've got to get to a mindset of how we actually create it and not assume we've got some. And that takes me to the discussion of middle powers, and I'm firmly of the view that the UK is a middle power, and I think that's it can be a very comfortable place to be. I don't think that's a sign of terminal decline. I think it's a statement of where the UK is, but it's about how we act as a influential and impactful middle power and what kind of statecraft you need to do that.
So say that you finish this research, it's taken up by government, and the UK actually changes its course on economic strategy. We adopt the building secure openness position. Is there a version where Britain leads rather than follows?
Yes, I think the answer to that is yes. I think we need to lead from a position of partnership. So I start very much from this framing of the UK, who we are. In economic life, there are 2 very large economies in the world, the US and China. There's the Europe, which is a combination of middle powers operating as a strong bloc on some issues, but operating as nation states on others. And then there's essentially a group of the rest of the economies in the world, and we're firmly in that group. I think the UK, and one of the things that's been really interesting on my travels is how much appetite there is for the UK to do a number of things, to be a thought leader in how we shape the future, to be a trusted partner, which is something that I think we need to strengthen. So how we work with not just other middle powers, but how we do that, how we can build some of the norms and standards and approaches we're going to need for the future. So we've looked at many domains in the work we're doing. And if you look at the trade domain I think is going to get reordered as we go through this period. It's going to get reshaped and reframed, and there's lots the UK can do in that. The technology domain, I think, is not yet ordered as a domain. And I think over 15 years, it's possible to imagine how that order emerges. And that is going to take some interesting statecraft around digital economy, around standards, around safety. And I think the UK has a strong interest in that and is also really well placed to shape that. But I think it's a model of partnership in the kind of collaborative leadership space rather than arriving onto the world with a plan and expecting others just to sign up.
And that takes me nicely to my final question, which is, if you could go back and change one decision or one assumption that shaped the UK's economic strategy over the past decade, what would that be? And what does that tell us about where we might be going?
Yeah. It's another great question, which many people in the UK would take you to a Europe conversation. But you will know that I have not started this project by should the UK rejoin the EU or not. And I think that is a not sufficiently interesting question. My answer to this question, I think, is actually something more about how we're organised as a country. And I think it's the separation of economics and security into two different professional career paths, two different sets of expertise, two different ways of viewing the world. And I've lived in that system, so I know what that's felt like. And I don't know that was necessarily a single decision that anybody took, but it was a sort of, I think it's linked to the assumption we made about the way the world was going to be, that you did security to kind of hold yourself into a secure environment, and then you went off and did your economics and kind of created your wealth, and your wealth then enabled you to fund your security, but they were really seen as separate things. And I think back to your geoeconomics cluster and the great work you're doing here. I think for your generation, these things are going to come back together, and it's about how we draw on the best of expertise from both of those disciplines and ways of viewing the world. And the UK is starting to do that, but that feels like one of the things that makes this environment most challenging for us, that they're separate, not together.
Do you think that this kind of thinking with silos between security and more geoeconomic questions, it was linked to maybe the belief that US will always be here to protect Europe, for instance, the UK with the special relationship? So is this shift coming from maybe also the new posture of the US in the international stage?
Yeah, I definitely think that was part of it. I mean, we in the UK always saw ourselves as being a strong member of that security partnership, obviously a member of NATO, having a very strong defence in the UK, but very much under the American security umbrella. So that is partly what enabled the separation of the economics and the security. And I think particularly for Europe, of course, there are other European members for whom that distinction was even greater. If you think about Germany and its strength in economics, but very different approach on security. So that security umbrella from the US is part of what enabled that separation to happen. And we are seeing a changing view in the US. They are expecting Europe to step up and provide more of its own security. I think Europe is responding to that, but that's essentially the demand. And I think there's at least a debate going on in the US about how it wants to view its role on the economic side. So exactly that. Some of that context has changed for us, and that's partly what's meaning we need to rethink.
Okay. And maybe, I know that many listeners would be interested about your view on the special relationship with the US. I don't know if you can share any thoughts on how do you see, if the special relationship is still something relevant to talk about?
Yes, I think I have a special relationship with the US, but that's because I studied there and I've lived there for 8 years of my life. I think I'm much more interested in a view of international relations grounded on interests and then values and where you go from there. And the UK and the US have shared interests. We've had them for a long time. We have shared interests in security in Europe, even if there's a shift in how that's delivered. We have shared interests in the kind of financial system, the trading system. So I think there's a lot where the UK and the US share interests. I think that will continue to be true. But I just think it's a more helpful way of thinking about life than applying labels that may come or go over time. And I come back to, I think, for the central question that I think the UK has got to grapple with, which is we're in this era of two very large economic powers, a neighbour next door that is a collective, and we're in none of those. And so how do we navigate the world that we find ourselves in is the sort of central question.
Fascinating.
Very good. Well, Jenny, that takes us to the end of our time. But thank you so much for joining Marc and I on the Oxford Policy Pod. And you've given us so much to think about. First off, I want to say that we will be watching and waiting for your keynote lecture coming up in September, where you'll present all of these ideas in fuller form, which will be fantastic. But on the topic of building secure openness, it's an exciting space, and I think already the UK has emerged as a thought leader here, and so look forward to seeing how that develops. But thank you so much again.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.